This is Lost Ruins, a game that's going for the sort of half Metroidvania, half survival action RPG kind of thing. It actually reminds me a lot of another game that was going for this exact same sort of idea that I played quite a long time ago now, called Unepic. It has got a lot of similarities to that game. The Metroidvania half of the game is in the map. It's got your classic Metroidvania map, very large, very sector-based. It's including things like your various save points posted throughout it, different vendors and vending machines, in fact, in this case, and side quests, and of course your teleporters that go to various entrances and exits of different areas of the map. So it's a very Metroidvania map. It even has areas that you can't access until you get certain items or keys or whatever later in the game. It feels very much like a Metroidvania in terms of its exploration. However, the survival-y aspect is in its combat, which is a much more slow and methodical combat system than your traditional Metroidvania normally has. Another similarity to Unepic, in fact, it does a similar thing with its combat system, and the idea is that you die very quickly. Enemies can kill you very easily. Even the most basic starting enemies remain a threat throughout most of the game, but the enemies themselves also tend to die quite quickly. They don't have a whole lot of health. There's very little that's quite spongy in this game. So basically each new room that you come to is like it's a little individual puzzle that you have to figure out how to get through alive, using all of your various consumables and items that you have at your disposal to most efficiently make it through the room to the next one. You can have 2 weapons as well as 2 spells equipped at any given time. Each weapon only has 1 basic attack, but that's why you can have 2 of them. And the 2 spells, well, you get all kinds of spells just by exploring and by completing side quests, and some of them you can buy as well. So there's quite a variety of equipment, a lot of weapons and spells for you to find and use. And different weapons have their own different swing speeds, and of course different spells have their own different costs, and there are several different damage types, which, as you would expect, different enemies are strong or weak against. So this is all so far pretty standard for a Metroidvania. But then you get to the actual combat itself and you realize that this is not a traditional Metroidvania control scheme at all. You actually lose all momentum in midair, which is a very weird feeling. I actually don't like it very much, to be honest, but it's just part of the control scheme. You lose all momentum in the air if you swing your weapon. No matter how much forward you are flying, if you use your weapon in midair, you immediately stop dead and just fall straight to the ground, which makes aerial combat not really much of an option, especially because the swing speeds of weapons are very slow. Your character is very, very slow with pretty much everything they do. Even the fastest weapons, the daggers, still don't attack that quickly. This means that most enemies in the game can run circles around you. Even the most basic of enemies are generally faster than you will ever be. Their attacks come out faster, they probably can take more hits than you, and they're just better than you in every way. And that is also another thing that Unepic did that is probably the biggest reason that this game reminds me of that, because the whole point of Unepic was that you were a Dungeons & Dragons nerd lost in a fantasy world that you did not belong in. So you weren't like a highly trained elite warrior or a knight or whatever. You could barely use a sword, and you couldn't do any sort of high-flying acrobatic combat either because you were just a normal dude. So you felt very unprepared, which was purposeful, and this game is going for a very similar concept where you are basically just a normal high school girl in a world that is full of much, much worse things, and they're all just better than you at pretty much everything, so you just have to sort of scrape by and survive, because you won't be showing any of the enemies up with like feats of combat skill or anything like that, because you're just not capable of that. And then, of course, you'll eventually reach a boss, at which point you'll realize just how deep over your head you actually are, because the bosses are actually, they go down pretty quickly. They don't have a lot of health, but they are very fast, and they can kill you in just a couple of hits. Oftentimes, a lot of bosses have hits that inflict damage over time as well, that stack. So if you get hit just a couple of times, even if the individual hits don't kill you, the damage over time effect definitely will. So you have to be very careful about actually just avoiding boss hits. A lot of the bosses feel like dances and like little miniature puzzles in and of themselves to figure out how best to just not get hit at all. There are very few scrappy combats in this game. You don't often get hit a whole bunch and then just barely scrape by. Usually you'll either execute a fight very well and leave with pretty much full health, or you'll just die, and there's very little middle ground. As far as weapons, you have the pretty standard fare at first, daggers, long swords, that sort of thing, but eventually you'll start getting more exotic weapons, and eventually you'll get like enchanted weapons that do multiple damage types at once and have varying swing speeds and effects, and there are some other things that you can get a hold of a little bit later, like this cursed scythe, for instance, that actually does more and more damage the more you hit with it, but if you miss, it'll inflict you with a stacking bleed that can kill you very easily, so you have to be very precise with it, but it is quite powerful once you stack it up. As far as spells go, You have different projectiles, chain lightning, and runic traps of pretty much every element, well, besides the chain lightning, which is, it's lightning. And you've also got some sort of non-elemental crazy stuff, like HP draining orbs that are kind of hard to use because they sort of float close to you, but if you position yourself just right, you can get a whole bunch of health back with them, and some other pretty cool things as well. These spells have quite a wind-up time to use, although not as much as most of the weapons do, but you do have a very limited amount of MP to use, and that brings us to the resource management. So, under normal circumstances, you have a very limited pool of HP and MP, and it does not regenerate at all. You have to rely on consumables to actually fill it back up. Even the safe areas, save points, and checkpoint statues in the game do not heal you or restore your MP at all, which I honestly don't actually like all that much. I'll be totally real about that. I actually prefer it if there's some sort of rest point that you can get to, some sort of safe zone that refills all of your resources when you actually go to it, but this game has no such thing. So you'll be entirely reliant on the consumables that you can find and buy. However, you don't get a lot of gold in this game, and consumables can actually rack up quite a high bill if you use them a whole lot. So you got to be careful about what you actually consume and how often, because chances are you will run out of money very quickly if you actually rely too heavily on them and use like a dozen or so every single boss or whatever. You won't be able to keep up with that. When you start the game, you also have one accessory slot, and after the first boss, you'll get a second accessory slot. These are extremely important because accessories are the things that you equip for your various powerful passive effects that are often found in Metroidvanias. Things like an air dash, resistance to certain damage types, all that sort of stuff. This is all gained via accessories. So you'll be very limited as to what you can actually equip, because although there are a lot of them, you only have these 2 slots to actually work with, so you'll find yourself swapping them out very often depending on what you're actually facing at the time, which is of course very deliberate. That's what the game wants you to do. And wants you to equip yourself constantly in different ways to best deal with whatever situation it's throwing at you at the time. Accordingly to this, accessories tend to have very powerful effects, sometimes even going so far as to nullify certain damage types or make you immune to certain status effects and damage over time effects and things. So they are very much meant to be swapped out very often to deal with whatever boss or area you're currently in. Although there are 2 accessories that I use for pretty much the entire game because they made me not reliant on consumables anymore. There's an accessory that reduces your maximum health but makes you regenerate your health, and there's one that increases your spell power a little bit and makes you regenerate MP. And these are the only reliable ways to actually regenerate your HP and MP in a way that's not reliant on the consumables, so I ended up actually just using these pretty much all the time and relying on specific consumables to make me immune to certain damage types for a temporary period instead of changing my accessories to make me immune more permanently. It's kind of a weird way to do it because it feels like I almost had to do this in order to not be really inconvenienced by the consumable system in the game. And since early on there's no way to regenerate your health or MP in any other way, although later on you do find more advanced weaponry and spells and things that have various effects that cause you to be healed or to regenerate MP in some way when a certain thing happens, like if you're standing in poison or if you get afflicted with a bleed. So it's not like there's absolutely no way to regenerate your health at all besides using this one accessory, but it is definitely the most reliable of the accessories to do that, if that's what you want to do. And MP is even more so harder to regenerate, so this is just about the only reliable way to get your MP back at all. And since melee combat in this game is actually very difficult and get you killed very easily, having some ranged options is very important. Exploration-wise, very important for a Metroidvania, even if it's not a pure Metroidvania and it's just sort of taking cues from them. This game still has a lot of exploration to complete. There are very large areas to traverse, and there are, of course, all sorts of bosses, some of which are optional, some of which are the actual main story bosses. And there's also lots of little secret bits and hard-to-reach areas with treasure chests and some other cool stuff in them. And there's tons of NPCs to find, and pretty much every NPC you come across can give you some sort of side quest or will be involved in a side quest at some point. Some of them are just like temporary little gags that give you a small reward. Some of them can give you access to entirely new things you couldn't otherwise get, like a new set of spells or a new weapon that they can make and then sell to you that you wouldn't otherwise be able to find in the world. So side quests are always worth doing. I did mention this is not a pure Metroidvania title, so this game does not have a level system at all. There's no experience and there are no levels to get. Killing enemies is mostly just for survival, not for experience, although of course drops are very important considering how important consumables and money can be. Getting drops is a very useful thing indeed in this game, so it's something that you want to do. So there is a point to combat, it's just not to gain levels. There's quite a bit of variety in the actual world areas. You've got like really pretty outdoor gardens with plant-themed enemies. You've got several different sort of underground-like biomes, like an actual dungeon, some sort of crazy necromancer's tomb, cave system, sewers, of course. Every game has to have sewers, naturally, and even a really pretty sort of stained glass cathedral-looking area later on in the game. So there's definitely a lot of area variety, a lot of different places for you to traverse, each with their own different sets of enemies and, of course, their own bosses somewhere near the end. The boss fights themselves are actually really fun because they tend to be, like I mentioned, quite fast. They're very lethal combat. They die easily, but so do you, so it's decided quite quickly upon starting the boss, generally speaking, which one of you is actually going to win. And that makes the boss fights really satisfying because they're kind of puzzle-like. You have to figure out how best to take them down, and once it fully clicks for you, once you figure out what you need to be doing, it tends to be over pretty quickly. Bosses tend to have multiple phases. A lot of the bosses in this game actually have 3 phases. Some have 2, and only like 1 or 2 of them have only 1. So there's a lot of boss fighting to be done in this game if that's something that you enjoy. It's definitely something that I enjoy. The bosses tend to be quite well designed with lots of projectile using attacks, some even completely filling the screen with projectiles, giving a little bit of a bullet hell vibe and making you sort of weave between them. You do have a dodge roll, by the way, that does have immunity frames. That's extremely important. Although I did find that pretty much all of the 3 phase bosses, with maybe one exception, the 3rd phase is actually the easiest of the 3, which is a little bit unusual, but I guess it does give you a little bit of a break after the previous 2, probably taking you several tries to actually pass successfully. And that is basically Lost Ruins. You'll be exploring this world, getting various new equipment and consumables to make your chances a little bit more likely against the horrible things that await you, fighting various bosses to get some really nice, important passive skill upgrades afterwards, and making your way through all of these individual areas eventually to the end. It's a relatively short game, probably about 8 hours or so if you want to complete the whole thing, although that of course is going to vary a little bit depending on how you play and if you're trying to do every single side quest and everything like I usually do. It's actually a really fun time. I really enjoyed my time with it, but this does lead me on to one major complaint that I have about the game that you're probably expecting if you've been following this game at all, and that is that the combat, even though I understand what they're going for, it does feel like it's maybe missing something, or that there's something about it that's not quite right. Because I've played Unepic, I understand the idea of this sort of survival-y Metroidvania making you very slow and not very capable in comparison to the enemies. I get that concept, and I've played other games that have done it very well before, but I feel like this game kind of misses the mark just a little bit, not in a way that ruins the game or anything, but in a way that makes it maybe more frustrating than it needs to be, because you're so incredibly slow. Everything you do is so slow, and the enemies are all just massively fast compared to you. It makes everything less of a challenge and more just frustrating sometimes. Sometimes it feels like it's going for the puzzle aspect to make enemies feel like a puzzle so that you know how to get through them efficiently every time. You got to figure it out like a puzzle. Sometimes it feels more like you just have to cheese the enemies in order to get through them effectively. And one of the main problems I have is your dodge roll is incredibly slow. The first little bit of it doesn't have immunity frames, so you have to do it kind of early, but has a really long set of recovery frames where you cannot dodge again afterwards for quite a long time. It's in fact so slow that you can dodge an enemy's attack and they will have time to ready and be about halfway through their next attack before you even stand up. It's so slow that enemies will constantly outpace you and even be able to hit you right after you exit your dodge before you have time to do another one if you didn't dodge far enough away. It's easy to walk into a room with a new enemy, swing your weapon, and because your swings take so long to come out, the enemy can just attack you and constantly interrupt your swings every time, so you'll swing, get hit, swing, get hit, swing, get hit, die. And that'll be your introduction to a new enemy type. It's just a little bit brutal. Like I said, I get what they're going for, and I'm not opposed to what they're going for because I've played games like Unepic that have done it in the past very well, and I think that this game almost gets there, but there's just a little bit of something, and I think really it feels more like the enemies are just too fast and agile compared to you. The thing about Unepic is it made you slow and clunky, but it also made the enemies a bit predictable and relatively slow, so that you were able to use your movements to actually predict theirs and win once you actually learned all of their tricks. Whereas this game, the enemies are just so fast and agile that it almost feels like prediction doesn't matter, and you just have to sort of get lucky enough to start your swing before they start theirs, and maybe you'll hit them. So although I definitely do enjoy this game and I think it's absolutely worth playing, I did find some parts of it to be a little bit more annoying than challenging because everything you do feels so slow and clunky sometimes that it actually is to the game's detriment. Like, it's supposed to be slow and clunky because that's the theme of your character, but there is a line as to how slow and clunky controls can feel before it starts to get a little bit annoying, instead of just purely challenging and sort of puzzle-like like it's clearly trying for. But still, I do think that Lost Ruins is absolutely worth a play if you enjoy Metroidvanias or your sort of survival-y action RPGs. I think it actually does it really well for the most part, and the boss fights and overall combat is still quite fun, even though sometimes I found it frustrating, and the actual variety and stuff that you can use is really nice. And of course, as you're probably noticing in the background, the art style is really fantastic. If you like anime art styles, of course, you do have to have a tolerance for the anime, but if you do like that, this game has very beautiful pixel art that's quite detailed. It's got a nice glow to everything, and it all looks quite good. So that is Lost Ruins. You can find the link to the Steam store page in the description below this video if you want to go check it out. I'd recommend it. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.